Hello everyone, so I am very honoured to say that this episode of the Never Eat Pears podcast we are joined by Tharries to talk about Series 1 of Doctor Who. Now I'm just putting in this clip first just because we had a couple of technical issues on the day, so unfortunately it's only an audio based podcast, but it's still a cracking podcast and I hope you all enjoy. Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Never Eat Pears podcast. Now, I would do a big, long intro, but I don't think we need to because I've got someone in who's much more interesting than me to talk about Series 1 of Doctor Who. It's Tharries. Hello, mate. How are we?
Hello, how are you? I don't know about more interesting. We'll see. I'll try my best to be entertaining. Oh, well, I appreciate that. A lot.
We've got to big up our guests. We're a small little channel and a small podcast, and I'm very grateful for you for coming on today.
That's no problem. Always happy to do it.
So as you know, we are starting our lovely, brilliant series reviewing every series of Doctor Who, which I'm really excited for. I'm glad you're on for Series 1. But first of all, I thought we'd just have a few quick-fire questions, get to know you a little bit, and get into it in a bit of a nice, fun, a little bit of a silly way. If that's all right with you?
No problem. Yeah, you knock yourself out.
So I find this question actually quite interesting. Which actor who's played the Doctor do you think could give an interesting interpretation of a different characterisation of a Doctor? So, for example, I've always thought that Christopher Eccleston, as an actor, could do a very interesting 12th Doctor.
Okay, so a different actor as a different incarnation would be the pitch there. Okay, let me think. I mean, there's an argument to be made that Peter could do any of them, as in Capaldi, just because he's the most,
he's that caliber of actor, isn't he?
Yeah, he's that flexible, but I feel like that's partially the boring answer. So, I would like to have seen, I would like to have seen maybe Colin do a more Ninth Doctor. I think that would be interesting, because I think that's kind of what they wanted to do with him, but they just didn't really know how to do it. So I think Colin, written in a similar way to the Ninth Doctor, would be a good watch.
That is when you first say that is certainly an odd choice, but I actually think that would work very well. That is a very interesting answer.
Thank you.
So what is your favourite, not season necessarily, but the arc of a season, how an entire season comes together to tell one story?
Okay, so yeah, that's an interesting question, because obviously favourite series would be like Series 5, at least revival-wise, but obviously I wouldn't say the Pandorica arc is my favourite of the arcs. Probably, I would say, in terms of at least if we're talking revival Who exclusively, I'd say the Saxon arc in Series 3 is really strong. I would say that build-up and the You Are Not Alone and all of that stuff, Lazarus with the de-aging technology, all sort of crescendos into this bit of chaos towards the end. So I'm tempted to say Series 3's build-up, particularly surrounding Bert Saxton and the Master and all that sort of stuff.
Lovely choice. So what would be your episode that you would show to someone to convince them to get into Doctor Who?
Oh, it's funny you should ask this, because I was thinking about this earlier on. I was talking to a friend about it. You're
pre-preparing.
Yeah, I know. I'm doing better than I was in school. Look at that. Probably, I think I've thought about this. I think 11th Hour would be my choice. Obviously, it's a Doctor introduction, which inherently leads to it being a relatively good introduction. The reason I wouldn't pick Rose, ironically, is we'll go on to talk about Series 1. Whilst I do think it's a great introduction of its own right, I also think maybe for a modern TV audience, it might seem slightly dated to some people. And I think 11th Hour being slightly more recent, the cameras being slightly, higher def, or whatever def they were using in Series 5, it's probably closer to what they would expect now. It's quite fast-paced. And yeah, that's probably what I would introduce someone with now, I think.
I think it's interesting you say that, because obviously we'll get on to Series 1 in a lot more depth in a bit, but I think, because I've thought about this, the difference between telly in like 2005 and how that feels, and the gap between that and 2010 when you had the hour. That's only 5 years. Compared to 2010 and now, the gap actually probably feels smaller, which is quite weird.
Completely. I think it's just there's like an element of, I guess, with everything, like technology kind of eventually, obviously, it'll still progress, but there'll be a sort of like a stagnation period where there's only like so good things can look. You find that with like, phones at the minute, all phones kind of look the same. There's kind of an element of like homogeneousness with it, and like I guess like video games as well. We're sort of getting to the point where it's like you look at the difference between like a PS4 and a PS5, and it's like, there's some nicer bits. You can see a bit more rain in one of them maybe, but like we're sort of reaching the limits of what we can do, and I think that's kind of the similar case with television and like visuals of that, of like, especially with a show with Doctor Who's budget, it's like how good can it realistically get in terms of visually? And I think we've been, obviously. I think the Whittaker sometimes looks like, really good. But I think when that's at its best, that's almost, about as good as we're going to get it. I could be proven wrong next year. We'll see. But, yeah.
Brilliant. So which Doctor would you like to have a drink with? So this can be an incarnation of the Doctor, or an actor who's played the Doctor, or if you really want to push the boat out, just an actor who's been in Doctor Who in general. Take your pick.
Oh, that's a good question. There's a lot of avenues you can take that. On the one hand, obviously, I love 11, as people will know. However, he doesn't strike me as the sit down and have a drink type. I feel like he'd get bored. So I think in terms of sitting down and having a drink with a Doctor, I would say probably Chris, as in like Chris's Doctor. In terms of person, either I think David or Peter, just because I can imagine various drunk natterings about Doctor Who. And then comes to any actor, I think Tom Baker would be fascinating to just listen to.
Yeah.
So I think those three would be my choice. Well, 4, I guess.
Yeah, I think if anyone's watched my channel for a long time, they know I would do anything on this earth to sit down with David Tennant for however long I could.
Yeah. He'd be a very fun chat.
What a man. And the last question, you can pick one character from any of Doctor Who to be a spin-off in RTD2. What are you picking?
So any character in Doctor Who, we're talking just the show or expanded or whatever? Wide open.
Whatever spin-off you'd want to see, pick it.
I'm going to pick this because it's a more obscure one. I guess I've always thought an Absalom Dack spin-off would be really fun. For those of you who don't know, Absalom Dack was a comic character back when Marvel were doing the Doctor Who comics. And his basic thing is his family gets killed by a bunch of Daleks, and he just becomes an insane murderer. And he's the second biggest, like, he's the only person who can threaten the Daleks and scare them outside of the Doctor, but obviously the way he goes about it are polar opposites to the Doctor. The Doctor is, more pacifist. He is the complete opposite. He was just like, tear them apart with like a chainsaw type thing. And I think you could, there's a story, if you didn't want to use the Daleks every episode, which is understandable, you could probably have him be some sort of space bounty hunter, with the Daleks being his main foe, as with the Doctor. And yeah, make it just really like silly and fun, but also like kind of The Boys-esque, but Doctor Who. Does that make sense? Like I could see that really working. And I do think that speaking of The Boys, Carl Urban, who's Billy the Butcher in that show, would be perfect casting for it. So yeah, I'd pitch that.
You have completely sold me for multiple reasons. First of all, I love Carl Urban, and I love The Boys, and that sounds like great casting for that character. And second of all, I think because of what Doctor Who is as a show, and you kind of need a spin-off to fit inside that universe, but also to be, like, to have its own tone and style within its own right. I actually think that is a very good way to to explore the Doctor Who universe, but without a character, without telling stories that feel too similar to Doctor Who. So I think they've done very well there.
Because well, thank you. Because his moral philosophy is like completely different, and his origin is totally different and distinct. And there's ways that you could definitely play with that 100%. You can even have like what they did with Class, have the Doctor appear in like an episode, and even just at the end as like a cameo in one of the episodes, or like what they did with Sarah Jane Adventures as well. Like that would be really fun, especially if it was if you could pick a Doctor, like if you could pick like. Imagine if it was like Dak and maybe like Time Lord Victorious 10, like would be particularly interesting. But yeah, anything with Absalom Dak I think would be a great choice for a spin-off.
That sounds very good. I would definitely. I say I'll definitely watch it, but then if it's got Doctor Who branding on it, I'm gonna watch it anyway. But so let's get on to Series 1 of Doctor Who. What are your overall thoughts?
Series 1, I mean, it's so difficult to kind of because the thing is with Series 1, you kind of got to look at it in the context of when it was made. Obviously, like it's still to this day one of my favorite like series overall, and I think it doesn't really, in my opinion, put like a really big foot wrong like some series do. It's pretty consistently great throughout. It's definitely got that early 2000s cheese to it, but that's why we love it. I would say it kind of, I think things like the Time War, which is kind of what the early new series was about, was a stroke of genius and really made that unique when compared to the classic series. I think Christopher Eccleston, for a modern, more grounded, I suppose, less quirky and affable take on the Doctor, absolutely shines, and I think it's a cruel shame we only got to see him do one series. I think, casting across the board is generally, obviously, there's some of the casting that we look back on with less fondness for obvious reasons these days. But, overall, it's a really, really, really solid run of television, and I think we have a lot to thank it for in terms of where we are today with Doctor Who and where it's going.
I think it's one of those series. So I look back on, I think the entire RTD run, I can't really remember a time in my childhood where I didn't have it on in my house pretty consistently. So, I mean, that's where I think a conversation of bias comes into it, where, for example, like you said, people sometimes will criticise the 2005 E-ness of it, and a lot of the domestic drama that gets brought into the show.
Yeah.
I've always found I've really enjoyed those elements. First of all, because they work and they're very of their time, but they don't bring me out of it. But also because I have to admit I'm very used to them as elements of the show, because they're.
Well, I think this is it.
New.
I think people forget. Nowadays we're kind of used to more elaborate kind of into like in IPs being in our entertainment. Marvel is the biggest thing in the world, and it has giant purple men with like space stones and talking raccoons and space wizards and all this sort of thing, and that's pretty mainstream. But back in 2005, nerd culture wasn't really what it is now. It was still more of a fringe, that sort of stereotype of the sort of national health glasses and the sort of dweeby man who struggled with women. That was the stereotype of nerds back then, and of geek and nerd and pop culture. Whereas now, obviously people are a lot more used to the ideas of science fiction and of these fantasy epics. So I think using the domesticity that casual audiences in the early 2000s were used to as a way to propel them into that fantasy, I think was a core reason why the new series worked as well as it did initially. Obviously, I think now, especially Moffat, I think he did a good job in at least early Series 5 of kind of keeping to a similar format to what Russel sort of introduced, but kind of growing out the fantasy a bit to kind of cater to the emerging, younger, sort of fantasy fairy tale demographic type thing that were used to things like, I don't know, Harry Potter off the top of my head, and Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, for the time, it works incredibly well. And I don't think that a revival could have worked the same way if it was just the classic series, but with nicer cameras.
I think, first of all, a brilliant thing to take from that is, since 2005, nerds rule the world. We are the majority now, which is always great. And I think I agree. This is, I think, just like people will applaud Christopher Eccleston coming into the show and giving the performance that he does. I also think just people do sometimes forget that this show was very much made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the style that TV was made, and bringing it back and almost having to redefine what the show is whilst keeping its core principles. I think, obviously, you don't want to be one of these people that goes, oh, it's the first one, so it has to be the best. But I think, in terms of this show, knowing what had come beforehand and knowing what it was going to lead to, one of the big strengths of this series is that it manages to carry the weight of this giant brand and propel it forward.
100%. Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember, like, as I said, the idea of Doctor Who was roundly mocked by people. It was seen as some cheap bit of thing from the 80s with a bunch of tinfoil that was best left to the past. There was a lot of stigma against it, and to overcome that so triumphantly, they had to do something right. They had to be doing something right to get it as good as they got it. And like I said, I think core aspect of that is the domesticity, but also just I think things like the character writing and the personability and the human aspect of characters like the Doctor. The Doctor is, in Series 1, far more vulnerable than he'd ever been before, and arguably would go on to be. I think there's very few Doctors that are as vulnerable as Christopher Eccleston is in that first series, even after Series 1. So, and I think that was core to people being like, oh, he's not just some weird alien guy. I can actually relate to this character beyond just, he's the one with the time machine, he's the one, who stops the monsters kind of thing. Whereas, it's like, obviously the companion still serves their role as the audience surrogate, but you also have a level of, a window into how the Doctor thinks and acts that you wouldn't have had previously, or at least to the general public wouldn't have been as obvious.
Yeah, I think in terms of Christopher Eccleston and the characterization and the way the show gets brought into the modern world, obviously you can say what you want about the Time War coming and going and Gallifrey coming and going, but in terms of the foundations it left, and the foundations we started with in terms of the Time War, and that being such a big characterization for Chris Eccleston's Doctor, I think it's a really smart move. It gives a modern Doctor this really great way of, like, almost grounding the character and it was really interesting to see Chris Eccleston as an actor play with a lot of people forget this is actually a very fun incarnation of the Doctor who is very entertaining, very funny. This is Series 1 is a very funny series of Doctor Who. And I think what it manages to do is create this great contrast when you get into episodes such as Dalek, and you get into all these episodes where you really get to see you get to see such a wide range of a Doctor, which is kind of like linchpinned by the Time War, that it's great writing and a fantastic performance.
100%, yeah. I think you make an interesting point there with the whole people see him as the darker one. I think he is, but I do think you're right in that there's an element of what happens with the first Doctor, I think, where a lot of people just see the first Doctor as, oh, he's the grumpy one. He's the one that, is just grumpy and crotchety and go and make me some tea and all this. The 5 Doctors repeated it, and then Twice Upon a Time repeated it again and things like that. But if you go back and watch the first Doctor, sure, he's like that initially. But come, things like the Romans, he's having the time of his life. He's laughing, joking, karate chopping people. He's having the time of his life. He isn't just this crotchety old man. And in the same way, I think, people simplify Chris as he's the depressed one, he's the morose one, when I think in some ways he's one of the more human ones in that, yes, he can feel those things, but he also expresses joy more openly than a lot of the classic Doctors did. You know, when was like obviously, you know, I'm just thinking of a random example, like Peter Davison, Fifth Doctor. He was very, we've got to do this. Get down to business, Tegan. You stand over there. We've got to do this before the world blows up. Like, it was more. I think generally the 80s was kind of a bit more somber with its Doctor Who. You know, particularly things like Eric Sayward, Robert Holmes coming back for like things like Caves and Returning. And don't get me wrong, I love a lot of those stories, but I think you're right in that the Series 1 injects a lot of, I guess, like jest and fun and, yeah, just a kind of sense of frivolity without ever making it feel too, I guess, like making the stakes feel lesser or making it feel as though it's cheapening it. It kind of strikes that balance exceedingly well.
In terms of, like, for example, I would in no way suggest, for example, that Chris Eccleston's Doctor goes through as much as Capaldi's, for example. But in terms of showing so much of a range and a character arc and a character dealing with what they're dealing with, and yet coming out of their shell in a nice way, like, I definitely think there is, you see differences between the start and the end of the series for this Doctor. And I think in terms of an arc that a Doctor goes on compared to the amount of time they get on screen throughout classic modern Who, this is one of the best examples of a Doctor being explored in their full range, especially in the amount of time they get.
I completely agree. I think I would argue 9 has one of the strongest arcs, in my opinion, in that you can see the progress episode by episode. You know, it doesn't. It's one of those things with some Doctors. Obviously, you mentioned Capaldi earlier. I know a lot of people love the Capaldi arc, and I do love aspects of it. I do think there are issues with consistency, though, and sort of, you know, bits of stuff. You know, you don't really see the development as much on screen in certain cases. Whereas, like here, you can see him slowly opening up the more and more you watch. You know, Rose, he's very much this outside figure that Rose is trying to learn about. Come the end of the world, after they've, you know, saved Platform 1 together, he's willing to open up about, you know, the Time War in his past and all that sort of stuff. And little by little, she sort of chips away at him. And obviously, I know a lot of people by the end of when it comes to Series 2 with David Tennant, people are like, oh, you know, I don't like the love thing. And I'm not a huge romance fan in Doctor Who. However, I think given all that Rose does to kind of lift the Doctor out of his sort of depression, it makes sense why he would fall for her in that way. So I get what they were going for when it comes to that. Sorry, that was a long tangent. I hope you get what I was getting at.
No, 100%. I mean, I think I'm actually going to compare this to a different bit of Tennant Who, and as we'll all know, I bloody love me some David Tennant Doctor Who. But if you compare the arc of Series 1 to, say, Time Lord Victorious kind of end of David Tennant's arc, this one feels so slow, so gradual, and earned is the best way I can put it. It feels so earned throughout it. Whereas Time Lord Victorious, to me, however much I like specific elements of it, Waters of Mars, a couple of bits of the extended media, but it kind of feels like we get a couple of lines that set it up in Stolen Earth Journey's End, and then it kind of just boom into the forefront, bang. And you know, I think I don't want to repeat myself too much, but in terms of a Doctor, in terms of performance, in terms of an arc, Series 1 deals with it better than most series does, and I think it'll be pretty tough to beat going forward.
I think the thing with Time Lord Victorious is, I would say it's probably subtler, and I don't mean that as a positive or a negative necessarily. It's just something you'll notice. Like, for example, you know, with things like Time Lord Victorious, it'll be sort of in Voyage of the Damned. You know, they'll really play into the Jesus allegory stuff with him being lifted up by the heavenly hosts, or you'll get the bit in Human Nature Family of Blood where he, at the end of that two-parter, he'll punish the family and all this sort of stuff. And it kind of creeps in, but obviously, yeah, it's with series 1, it's made very obvious how he started and how he is now, and I do think it makes for a very interesting character to watch, rather than the Doctor remaining relatively static, which obviously, you know, even if you think he didn't, obviously was kind of perceived to be the case by some people, perhaps, maybe before this. It's just the Doctor's the Doctor, he's the good guy, whereas, you know, I guess series 1 asks the question, but he's not always. You know, what if he wasn't always? What if he didn't always know what to do? What if he made the wrong choice one day and it haunted him? You know, that's a really interesting way of taking that character.
So moving away from Chris Eccleston, how do you feel about, because this series probably does contain some more controversial episodes. Obviously, we'll ignore the casting complications that obviously they weren't intending. But in terms of, I mean, I say Rose is a controversial character. That's probably more series 2 Rose. But in terms of the family elements, in terms of the domestic elements, as I've said, I find occasionally that it could have probably been put on the back burner a little bit, but overall I think it works as an element that you start with, you go away for a bit, you come back to and have some family drama.
Yeah.
I think that works, but how do you feel?
I think I agree. I think it works for the time. I can completely understand, though, you know, maybe wanting it to be put on the back foot a bit more. I think they really perfected the family model, and obviously not to compare it too much to Other Who, but it's kind of inevitable when Doctor Who fans talk about Doctor Who. It's hard for us to just look at one thing exclusively without comparing it to other things. I think Russell would really go on to perfect that family model with Series 4, though. In that the Noble family weren't as present as the Tylers, arguably, in Series 1 at least. But I would say that you got enough of them for the casuals to still be engaged, but also didn't feel like it was detracting. If anything, it added to the flavour, because that sounds really weird. It sounds like I'm describing it like a menu, but you know what I mean? It added to the context of, you know, Donna feeling unsatisfied with her life as it was, and Sylvia and the way she was treated, and it kind of made that cathartic moment at the end of Partners in Crime where she left all that more rewarding. And there is an element of that in Rose when Rose is contemplating whether to go or not, and he's like, and she's like, "Oh, I've got to look after this stupid lump" or something. I think she's in reference to Mickey, and she's like, "Actually, what have you done for me recently? See you in a bit. I'm going to go see the universe for a bit." And there's elements of that there. But yeah, I guess what I was going to try and say is I think they did a better job later on showing people's desire to travel and using the family to be a springboard for that, as they did early on. Honestly, it is there. You know, you have the bits in Babel Parting of the Ways where you have Rose being like, you know, I can't just like sit here and eat chips, you know, for the rest of my life. I want to actually do something. And it made very clear in things like Army Goes Doomsday as well, where it's like for the first 19 years of my life, nothing happened. But yeah, I think it works for the time when it comes to the family stuff. I've never found it overly intrusive. I'd say in cases like Father's Day, it's completely like necessary. And you can 100% see why they decided to do it. And things, I guess, like with End of the World as well, where it's her first call home on an alien, well, not an alien world, but you know what I mean, Platform 1, where they're observing Earth basically be burnt alive and aliens are watching and stuff. It's kind of important to establish, you know, that difference and that juxtaposition with the audience between this is where she was and this is where she is. There probably are times that I'd say the only time I wouldn't even say it goes too far, but I would say the point in which the family probably are a bit too ever-present would probably be the Slitheen two-parter. I enjoy that two-parter, but I do think you get a lot of the family more than, you know, the characters that you've grown to like already. We didn't, obviously, you know, people wouldn't have always liked Jackie Tyler and Mickey Smith or you know, any of those, which sounds blasphemous now, but obviously at the time, I think perhaps you could argue that maybe that was the one where they were a bit too present, but, even then, I don't mind it too much.
Yeah, I think... Because I think you've brought a couple of good examples there. I do think Aliens in London World War III is where it gets a little bit much. I also think your comparison to Series 4 is very good, because I think the two things you have to balance is making interesting characters and weaving them into the story very well. I think Series 1 and 2 has interesting characters for me that aren't always woven in the story very well.
I get that.
I think Series 3... So I think Series 3 sometimes manages to weave the characters in very well, but I've got to admit I've never found Martha's family particularly interesting.
Martha's family are the least memorable of the RTD families by a lot, and I think part of that was possibly by design. Maybe he felt, I've just done a huge family dynamic for the Doctor. Let's try and maybe... kind of like you say, kind of deviate away from that a little bit more. But I do agree, in terms of the families, they are the least memorable of the pack. 100% of the pack, yeah.
But that's why I think Series 4 works so well, is that...
Yeah, it finds that balance.
You definitely take the story elements that have worked, creating interesting characters, and I could go on about how much I love Series 4 all day, but this isn't the time for that.
No, this is Series 1. Series 1.
So what are, and obviously I'm not going to limit you to one. If there's 2, 3, 4, you really want to go into a bit more depth in. Where are your standout episodes in Series 1?
Okay, so I think I'll say them first, then we can sort of pick through them as we go. I guess obviously the thing is with Series 1 is it doesn't really drop the ball to me that hard. As I said, I think the main 3 standout stories I would think of in terms of, wow, this is like gold, would be obviously, I'm not going to be blowing anyone's mind by saying Dalek. I'd also say Anti-Child Doctor Dances and the finale 2-parter would be my 3 that are the peak of the series, in my opinion. And yeah, we can cover those if you want, but those would probably be my 3 selections for this is the peak of that series.
I mean, I'm not sure whether you intended it or not, but you bring up an interesting way of going. So the 3 stories that involve Daleks, you've all picked. I've always been of the stance that Series 1 does the Daleks the best. There might be other Dalek stories that, those might not be top 2 in a ranking of Dalek stories, but in terms of, because of obviously the 2 main styles of Dalek stories we get in Who are a main focus on one or a small amount of Daleks, and then the big classic invasion. In terms of a story where you have one Dalek doing its thing, showing how scary one Dalek can be, I think it's pretty undeniable that Dalek is miles ahead of the competition. And then obviously, I'm not sure whether I find it the best big classic Dalek army story, but Bad Wolf and Parting of the Ways is a fantastic Dalek story and a fantastic finale.
100%, yeah. So with the Daleks, I guess I think something that they did with the Daleks that really added a dimension to them was, obviously, the stereotype was with the Daleks, and obviously I keep bringing up the stereotypes of the show prior to Series 1 because they were so informative as to how this new series would be shaped, to the point where Robert Shearman allegedly sat down with his wife to discuss the stereotypes of Daleks, that they couldn't climb stairs, that you could just walk around it, etc., and made sure that each one of those points was thoroughly debunked and rebuked in this story. So that's why you've got the rotating middle section, you get a reprise of the stair climbing from Remembrance of the Daleks, you get all of that sort of stuff. But one thing I think the Daleks did really well beyond that, and I think, it wasn't really a dimension that existed for them before, is kind of comparing them to the Doctor. Because when you think about it, both of them are all-powerful races that have the abilities of time travel, and especially with how the Time Lords have been gone on to be viewed throughout the revival, the Time Lords weren't always perfect beings either. there's plenty of times where, there's even that line in Night of the Doctor, Paul McGann says, look on the right side, at least I'm not Dalek, and, Cass responds, well, who can tell the difference anymore? It proves that there's not as big of a gap between the Doctor and the Daleks as he would like to believe that there was. And I think it's fascinating to watch Dalek because you're watching a Dalek become more like what the Doctor would normally be, seeing the beauty and the wonder of the universe. On the other hand, as the Dalek is progressing through Van Statten's collection, that the Doctor is becoming more quick to aggression, more frustrated, and in essence, more like a Dalek. And I think that's a really fascinating way of playing with it. And I think that's something that the revival uses to great success, and kind of, there's even, it's a theme that's carried on throughout that era. You get, even in Series 3, you get the human Dalek hybrid, which is very much kind of playing on a similar thing to what Dalek did, with Rose obviously touching the Dalek, and the time vortex energy restores it, but also gives it some of Rose's personality. You get, as well, Series 4, Davros, who literally says, you take ordinary people and you fashion them into weapons, which are not a million miles away from the Daleks building their own weapon in that series. So I really love the way they use the Dalek-Doctor dynamic in this era, and it's kind of, and the reason I say this era is it's never really seen since, it's never really been done in that way since, and I think it's the most interesting way they've been done, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think even because whether you ignore the Daleks' involvement in it or not, I think obviously you want Doctor Who to sometimes be a bit silly and fun, but a way to always get drama and intrigue and take things to a deeper level is take the Doctor as a character off their pedestal a little bit, and I think that's even I think you can argue it happened with Capaldi sometimes. Even, to be fair, in Dalek forms, obviously not explored tons, but with Rusty, for example, it's always been an interesting way to go, and I think especially Dalek as an episode. I think Dalek as an episode is one of those things where, if any, it's one of those, with a couple of the American elements, and just there's a couple of bits where it's gotten a bit dated, it's a little bit cheesy at points, but those elements that really work, those elements that feel like core Doctor Who, that take risks but then feel classic at the same time, that's when this series is firing on all cylinders.
Yeah, I think another thing with the Daleks that I love in how they handled them in Russel's era is they use narrative devices to get Daleks to act, sort of beyond the capacities of a Dalek without it ever feeling out of character. Because when you boil it down, Daleks they're simple creatures, They believe in one thing: hatred of anything that's not a Dalek. And even if they're not a Dalek, they kind of hate themselves. But the point I'm trying to make is, so Dalek, you have, as I said, Rose touching the Dalek, which gives it sort of her personality, which allows it to basically see the universe before it eventually decides, obviously it can't be a Dalek anymore, self-destructs. Series 2, you get the Cult of Skaro. Cult of Skaro exists literally in the text to think beyond the capacities a Dalek would normally think. And that's taken to its extreme in Series 3, where you have Dalek Sect discussing the idea of, okay, what if, the Daleks became more like humans, and you would have those scenes of the Daleks debating it and purity and stuff. So I guess what I'm trying to say is they managed to play with Daleks in a way that always felt natural, and always felt like it was adding rather than contradicting what the Daleks were previously. And that's a hard line to balance, but I think Russell is the only one to truly master it. Because you look at Moffat's Daleks, as an example, I would argue, obviously, I would say Victory, to an extent, does get the Dalek-Doctor dynamic right. The scene with 11 and the spanner and the Ironside is quite good. But I would also say, he would kind of just add gimmicks to them occasionally, and they'd feel a bit odd. Like, for example, in Asylum of the Daleks having a parliament, or in Series 9, the Daleks, saying I love you when they're saying exterminate, and all these other things. It's very Moffat, but I don't think it feels quite as natural as the Daleks, contemplating, their own mortality and finding new ways to survive by mimicking humans a bit more. That feels a bit more authentic to me than that latter option. And then I guess to go full whack with the comparison with the Chibnall Daleks, I guess the problem is on the surface level they seem more similar to the Russel Daleks. I would say my only issue with those would be they kind of a bit too caricaturish in that they're very much. You watch something like Eve of the Daleks and their dialogue is very much Daleks do not do this. They don't do this. It's very sort of playing on what the idea of a Dalek is without really expanding upon it. So I think Russel is the only one to truly balance that fully 100%. I think he gets the Daleks probably better than any other New Who showrunner in my opinion. And I think Series 1 is a pretty great representation of that on its own.
Yeah, I think with Moffat and Daleks, I would use the word and I agree that there are definitely elements that worked. I'm a big fan of Into the Dalek. I think some elements of it.
Yeah, I like Into the Dalek.
But I think Moffat loved a gimmick. Moffat loved.
Yeah, he did.
It's Daleks, but in an asylum. Oh, we're going inside a Dalek. Oh, it's there are a couple of others that. Yeah, it's the Series 9 opener. That feels gimmicky.
Yeah.
It's a lot of that. But I think bringing things back to Series 1, it's this brilliant balance of. I think sometimes it's actually easier to make the Daleks feel scarier as a single entity than as for me the best Chibnall Dalek story has always been Resolution.
I agree.
I've always found that just taking the Daleks back to their basics, one scary Dalek telling a simple story, but then where Chibnall fell for me was Revolution, and Eve didn't work that well for me. Whereas if you're comparing that back to Parting of the Ways, making a group of Daleks scary. If you're looking at...
But you know what I think works for that? I think the big thing that I think works there is the whole thing of them actually being converted humans and the idea of them being driven mad by their own flesh, I think is a fascinating way to take it. And the fact that they're almost disgusted by themselves because, they're Daleks and that's what they believe. But of course, they're not truly Daleks and they hate that. They hate that they're not pure. They despise their own existence. I think that's almost word for word what Chris Eccleston says in the scene. And I think that just adds an extra dimension. And I think that's the thing. It doesn't have to be gimmicky, but just something to give them a bit more of a character than just a generic army can go a long way, I think, in making the Daleks feel more interesting of a threat. I mean, when it comes to things like Stolen Earth Journey's End, I think the way they do it is less so. I mean, the Daleks are pretty much the Daleks, but even then, you have things like Dalek Khan or Davros. Obviously, is a big player, and he can kind of, And even then, you've got things like the Daleks treating Davros as a pet. You get little things that just make them feel more unique as entities than perhaps they are otherwise, without them feeling too caricaturish or too, I guess. Strongly deviating away from the Daleks. To give Moffat some credit though before we return to Series 1, I just would like to say I think by the end he got the Cybermen the best with Different Time Doctor Falls. Just because I felt like I don't want to say Moffat did all the classics completely wrong because I think he nailed the Cybermen by the end. But with Series 1 I think the Daleks are impeccably done.
I think but all three, weirdly, because obviously one of them's two-part, and obviously they don't really feature in the first half of that story. But I think the one part about me that irritates me about Parting of the Ways, it's a very RTD trope. It's the not being able to successfully land a resolution to a finale.
Oh yeah, the Bad Wolf.
His classic Deus Ex Machina resolutions and the way to solve things have never worked for me. Obviously, the big famous example is Series 3. Series 3 and David Tennant becoming a floaty god has never worked for anyone. But I
don't mind it as much as some people, but I can't say it's the best way they could have ended it. It's an odd ending.
In terms of this one though, I think it works. I also think sometimes the problem with RTD Who is he creates such big set pieces and things to solve that sometimes there is no other way to resolve things. And I think this is one of the better ones. At least Rose doesn't. Even Rose does kind of become a god in some ways. But I think I think if it wasn't for the fact that it forced Chris to regenerate, obviously I'd have liked for Chris to stick around, but because it had stakes and consequences and carried through, that works. And at least they didn't raise the entire year, which again was stupid.
One of the reasons I can kind of give the RTD finales a bit of slack, because you're right, a lot of them are Deus Ex Machina. You know, Journey's End is another example. Donna presses a few buttons and the Daleks basically all die. You know, that doesn't sound great on paper, but where those moments, where those finales shine is in terms of their emotional weight and their emotional impact. The reason I've always been able to kind of give things like Bad Wolf Rose, less so in Series 3, but always like the Dr. Donna just reversing everything, is because of how big those emotional gut punches are towards the end. And I think that's a deliberate trick, you know, okay, yeah, this ending isn't great, but look, Donna's memory's about to get erased. Isn't that, like, terrible? It's like, it works. So it's kind of the sort of thing of, like, I can kind of excuse a bit of the lapse logic, because Russell can do the character and emotional beats really, really well. So it almost makes up for it to me, which is, but no, I agree with you. I think the fact that it causes Chris to regenerate as well kind of does help, because it doesn't feel like, okay, there is sacrifices to this ending, even if it is quite a convenient ending. So, I don't mind it as much in Parting of the Ways' this instance.
Yeah, I give Series 4 the excuse because I can't watch Donna losing her memories without at least having a bit of wet eye. Obviously Series 3, we'll never let them get away with that. But Series 1 is a balance of I would rather something a little bit more creative, but
and I guess even with like Series 2, you've got the basically the levers that just reverse the void thing. And I know obviously they do set up the levers earlier, so fair enough, but it does. Again, it's quite a convenient ending, but again,
it's
one thing that Russell does really well is built around the Rose departure and the inevitable sacrifice of her going to the other universe. So I think that's the thing. I think, whereas with, say, for example, I think Revolution pulls a similar trick with all the Daleks piling into a TARDIS and the TARDIS folding in on itself, collapsing, and boom, the Daleks are gone. But the difference with Revolution is no one was hurt. No one died, there was no sacrifice there wasn't any great, loss of life due to this decision being made to bring the Daleks to Earth. It just is a thing that happens. Whereas Russell always made sure, or at least most of the time, if there was going to be a bit of a BS ending, he'd have there be a consequence for it, And I think that's one of the reasons why I can tend to give some of those a bit more slack. I think as well, things like I mentioned as well, Empty Child Doctor Dances. Towards the end of that, obviously I know it's a Moffat written story, but it's in Series 1, so I guess it kind of counts. Moffat was also known for a bit of his Deus Ex Machina thing, and I guess there's an argument to be made that the nanogenes, or whatever they are, the things that control the Empty Child thing from the ship, him basically floating the particles towards them to reverse it, yeah, it's a bit convenient, but the emotional payoff for that, the everybody lives line, is so perfect, and what that doctor needed, that you almost don't care. You know what I mean? It's like they kind of use the emotional bits and the payoff and the sacrifice to great effect in order to make these endings feel more satisfying than they probably would be otherwise.
I think first of all, that's a great way to transition to the dances. I think in terms of that ending, yes, it probably is, again, a little Deus Ex Machina. That is one of my favourite endings to an episode of all time. In terms of, like we've previously said, feeding into the Chris Eccleston arc in a beautiful way. And to be fair, still feeling as an ending vaguely satisfying. And it also feeds into this idea that it's not like we're here as Doctor Who fans going, oh, for things to be emotional, everybody must die. In fact,
No.
This episode uses the opposite tact and manages to be even more effective while still feeling very Doctor Who, exploring a new monster, having a really interesting story, and what I love Doctor Who embracing sometimes, being scary.
100%, yeah, 100%. I think Ex-Child Doctor Dances is the perfect marriage of Moffat's fairy tale creepiness, taking ordinary things and making them bloody terrifying, and Russell's combination of that human aspect, and obviously it's got a lot of Moffat comedy roots as well, with the sort of proverbial dick measuring contest between the Doctor and Captain Jack Harkness. And yeah, that feels very Moffat-y, but like it balances that sort of, again, it's what I said, it's the domesticity of the Russell era and the sort of down-to-earthness and the humanity of the Russell era in conjunction with the almost like Tim Burton-esque horrors of Moffat to a degree of taking something that feels, which is very Doctor Who in its way as well, taking something that feels very normal. Obviously, I think that's another reason why the Autons in Rose work so well. Obviously, I know they predate Rose, obviously, but I think my brother was terrified of shop window dummies after seeing that episode. It's taking the ordinary and making it scary, and that's something that Moffat does incredibly well. And that is arguably the first instance of that, and would arguably continue to be used for things like the Weeping Angels, taking statues and making them assassin is something that's could only come from the mind of someone who is a true, creative and a true, visionary when it comes to storytelling. And I think the Empty Child is like a great example of that. It's also just a really fun story. Like I said, the comedic lines land, the dynamic is really fun. Obviously, we can't talk about one character as much, but we can talk about the character, just not the person who portrays him. But yeah. It is a really good, really, really good two-parter.
I obviously we all know what you're alluding to. I think I think that's what this series does well, is it does create these really incredible, likeable characters. Like, for example, Captain Jack appears in series 1 probably as much as he does in all of his other appearances combined, and I think as a character he's great. Obviously the controversial bits are a complete another different conversation that no one really wants to get into, I think
with Jack, I think what's done so masterfully about it is initially he's not meant to be a great guy. He's meant to be this kind of this a bit of a a bit of a scammer, bit of a you're a bit of a dick, really. But you come to like him because obviously Rose sees something good in him, and they make a very deliberate point of comparing him to the Doctor, not in a direct way that would feel forced, or in a way that's like kind of hammy, like they're actually related or something silly like that. It's just their circumstances are in some way similar. They're two guys who travel the world and use like spaceships and are very charismatic on the surface, but have some darker aspects to them. And I think they use that very well. And by the end, you're totally sold on Jack as a character and as a companion. Which, by contrast, mentioning someone else from series 1, Adam Mitchell is kind of the inverse of Jack, in that he fails, the companion Bechdel test, if you like. He is the opposite. He is selfish. He doesn't really see the wonder in it very much. He mainly is just in it for his own ends. And he basically just does it purely out of selfishness. Whereas Jack starts out as that. He comes to learn that actually saving people and enjoying the ride is a much more valuable asset than using the universe purely for its own benefits.
I mean, it's series 1 understanding character arcs. It does it brilliantly, even to a fact of again I ain't going to give any props to the actor, but in terms of the arc of Mickey going throughout 1, and to be fair, into a little bit of season 2 as well, him coming out of his shell a little bit more, and that, I think that is definitely a series 1 and 2 joint arc, but I think that is another arc that's done brilliantly, and I will, for example, defend the Slitheen 2-parter. As a kid, I had a lot of nostalgia.
I do enjoy it.
For the Slitheen. I think it's fun. Any criticism of politicians, I'm going to lap up. But...
Yeah, very true. That's why I'm looking forward to Russell coming back. Go on, give me that political edge, Russell. Love that.
The Tories.
Yeah, exactly.
But I hope so. But then obviously you've got other. It's just in terms of character arcs, it just works really well. But I think as well, going into then you've got the Slitheen 2-parter, but then going into Boomtown, I think Boomtown is very underrated. I think in terms of keeping things calm, not necessarily going for another big story. It's very small. It deals with the domestic elements very, very well. Has some very interesting drama, and again is a great stop on Chris Eccleston arcs. That's it probably wouldn't make it into my top 3 of series 1, for example, but in terms of in the conversation for underrated episodes in general, I think Boomtown makes it.
I would agree. I would also say with Boomtown, it actually, I'm going to get really wanky now, it shows the development of 9 exceedingly well, because if you think about it, 9, we saw him with Dalek, was happy to, let that creature die. And this is kind of the ultimate test for 9's development, being like, there's someone who has done demonstrable harm to Earth and to people. How is he going to deal with that? Is he going to send her off to die? Or, is he going to help? And that Boomtown only works, Boomtown can only work as well as it does because of how the Doctor progressed throughout Series 1. Because had he not had the arc that he had in Series 1, he probably wouldn't have thought twice about just sending her off to die. But you get that kind of moral quandary there, and obviously by the end she gets turned into an egg and dropped off and all that sort of stuff. I think Boomtown is a direct sort of showcase for the way the Doctor has grown. In the same way that Battle for the Planting the Way represents Rose's growth, seeing, obviously she was hesitant to go at the start of Rose and was content, or as content as could be with her modern life, and by that point she was like, no, I need more. And then obviously her development, whilst I do think there are some issues with her in Series 2, you get the whole bit with Christmas Invasion, which is technically at the end of Series 1, so we can kind of count it.
I'll give it to you.
While, she's basically struggling to imitate the Doctor in front of the Sycorax, and then obviously by Series 4, she's jumping universes and basically leading the unit and turn left. And, these characters are constantly... One of the things I love about Russell's universe in general that's very clearly established in Series 1 is it's never static. Characters are always progressing, their stories are always progressing, even if in the background, in a way that doesn't feel unnatural. He always manages to make those transitions feel natural based on what we've seen. And his universe just feels so much more alive and cohesive and intriguing as a result.
I think that's that. I totally agree in terms, especially like the dynamic of characters, like everything changing. I also think, and obviously this is a more of a RTD discussion as a whole, but I just love the way characters can like pop in and pop out. Obviously the big example, being Soul Earth Journey's End, but it definitely feels like more. Obviously there are different ways of doing that. I'm perfectly happy seeing 11, Amy and Rory, and River popping in occasionally.
Yeah, of course.
But both dynamics work incredibly well. But I think it's a testament to Russell's universe building and creating likeable characters that you can get to the end of Series 4 and pull characters from all 4 of his previous seasons and have them all gel and have it all just feel so satisfying.
have the same amount of fan effect and excitement as any classic companion coming back would have. You know, I think people forget this now, but as I said, you know, people like Rose Tyler, people like Martha Jones, people like Donna Noble weren't always fan favourite characters. You know, it's easy to look back at their returns now and Donna's return now and saying, obviously, she's a fan favourite. It wasn't always that way. They had to become fan favourites. And I think just the fact that there was so much hype around all these characters' return is emphasis enough on how much he made them lovable and how much people genuinely connected with them. You know, which is something you perhaps couldn't say as much with some Doctor Who that followed. Obviously, some cases are better than others, but I think you know what I'm referring to. You know,
there are certain people I reckon we leave alone and don't piss off today. I reckon.
Yeah. But you get what I mean.
I get what you mean. Is there an episode or a couple of episodes of season 1 that you obviously, because you've described it as quite a consistent series, and I'd agree. Are there episodes? Where's your least favourites? Where's your ones you don't revisit as much?
Honestly,
what's the lower?
The one I can think of one off the top of my head, and it's the one everyone jumps to, and I do think that is for a reason. I think it is the long game. The long game it's fine. It's not terrible. It's just the one I revisit the least. I don't have any huge, strong feelings on it. It's just my least favourite. You know, it does the whole... I do quite like the showcasing of Adam Mitchell as actually being a bad companion when compared to either Rose or Jack. I guess it's just, as an episode, it's not that interesting on its own. Or at least doesn't feel it to me. It mainly feels like it exists to set up Platform 1's further, basically, shit show in the finale. You know, how basically the Doctor's actions directly made the situation worse rather than better. The episode itself is rather... It's fine, but I'm not ever in a particular hurry to revisit it.
My opinion is any episode or anything in general that wastes Simon Pegg is a crime. It is a crime to culture. But on a serious note, it might be the dull answer, I've got an interesting one in a sec that I am interested to hear your thoughts on. But I think on this one I have to agree with. Let's face it, the quite standard generic opinion that the long game isn't necessarily bad. It's just there's nothing there that particularly sparks interest, and I definitely agree with you. I think it's one of those scripts that doesn't get made if you don't feel like you need to set up what becomes the game stage.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same way I feel about something like the Lazarus Experiment. Is the Lazarus Experiment terrible? No, probably not. Is it one I particularly love rewatching? No, not really. Like, it's there mainly to set up, the Master's going to be able to do de-aging tech in the finale. And there is some nice moments, but yeah, largely it's the same other thing with the long game. One episode I wanted to bring up as in a positive way, because I forgot to bring it up, and I'm just thinking now, is Father's Day. I think Father's Day is fantastic. Feels very Moffat, actually, despite the fact Paul Cornell wrote it, with the whole time travel angle. And it seems like the sort of story that should happen more in Doctor Who, but didn't up until that point, which I find fascinating. I love how it uses time travel, and I love the issues that causes between the Doctor and Rose. The whole, I should have known. No, the stupid, you. It's all about the universe doing something for you, which again is reflected via Adam Mitchell. But yeah, when it comes to Father's Day, I just love it as an emotional piece. I think the Reapers are awesome, and I think it's a crime that they were basically just discarded going forwards. And although to be fair, they would probably appear every other week in the Moffat era, but I love that as a premise, and I think it's wonderful. And it's one of those cases where I think the family stuff works really well.
Father's Day was was for me one of my big joys of the last few years, where I think as a kid it was one. It's harder to get into like the emotional side of it, and therefore as a kid, I'm not gonna lie, an 8-year-old me watched it and was a little bit bored by it. So
Yeah, I get that.
Over the past few years, like those, there are certain episodes, I genuinely can't think of another example off the top of my head, but there are certain episodes you look back on and you change your mind on because you can suddenly tap into, like, because at the end of the day, like, I completely agree, like, the Reapers are like incredibly cool concept, but I think at the end of the day, like, what works in this episode is its emotional core. And seems to be a big pro of like series 1 in general. It manages to have that emotional center, and it's just beautiful. Doctor Who.
Completely agree. Completely 100% agree. But yeah, I think in terms of like, I think those are the main episodes I probably want to highlight. I imagine. Yeah.
One episode, and I'm not sure whether this is... I think this is lightly controversial. I've never been able to vibe with The Unquiet Dead as an episode.
I mean, yeah, it probably is one of my lesser favourites. I think it's a decent episode. I enjoy it. Again, I think you'll probably... I probably agree in that after the long game, it's probably my second least favourite, probably. Not even saying it's bad. It's just out of the series 1 catalog, it's probably one of the ones I would jump to less.
It's one of those things where it's a mix of what styles of episodes do people personally enjoy. I'm not a massive fan of historicals in terms of meeting historical characters. You can do it right. For example, I think if you're gonna give Chibnall some praise, I think Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror is fantastic.
I think Vincent and the Doctor is a great example.
Vincent and the Doctor is a fantastic example.
Really well. Yeah,
and also I think obviously I like Doctor Who being scary. I've never been a fan of more like classic horror tropes kind of vibes, like like kind of like, oh, there's a ghost we've got to find it's like in 7B in Hyde, and you know how in every series of Sarah Jane there was always an episode where you'd go to a haunted house and you'd
I know the ones you're on about. 100%, yeah.
That kind of vibe has never been for me, and seeing as this story does both, and I think Charles Dickens is one of the weaker historical characters we've explored in New Who. Overall, I would say it's one of only a couple in Series 1 I would probably give a negative review to.
Yeah. No, that's I wouldn't even say negative for me. It's just like, it's just not one I would like. Again, I come back to the analogy of, if I've got the box set, what am I going to pick? Probably not The Unquiet Dead, probably not The Long Game. Because I don't think anything in Series 1 is truly, like, horribly abysmal, in my opinion. I don't think anything reaches that level. The worst it ever gets is, like, that was decent. And then the best it ever gets is, like, pure 10 out of 10 gold. Like, do this again type thing. But yeah.
So, overall, I think as we've discussed, I think Series 1 I think there are other series that I think hit higher highs, but I think pretty much every series hits lower lows. In terms of consistent quality, a fantastic Doctor-companion relationship, and Doctor arc, Series 1, I think, deserves its place. It deserves its place where it is loved by most members of the fandom.
100%. Yeah, I think the praise is deserved.
Well, unless you have anything to add, I think we've done a lovely, thorough review of Series 1.
A good job. I thoroughly enjoyed myself.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Obviously,
no problem.
Obviously, most people watching this are going to know who you are, but I'll whack all of your social links in.
Thanks,
anyway,
no worries.
If you're stupid enough to not be subscribed, following, all of that jazz, please go do it. And yeah, subscribe. Thanks. Cheers.
No worries. Take care. Bye-bye.